Well, good day, everyone. James Line here, and I'm talking today to Paul Coleman as a part of our series where we get out and talk to security leaders who are successful, creating a difference in their business, managing cyber risks, and of course, talking to them about what works and sometimes what doesn't work, which can be particularly good fun. Now, Paul is the VP of Information Security and Data Protection. He leads the security team at Orgvue, and they're a workforce planning platform that brings together strategy and people. But it's not your first role in security, of course. Paul's been around information security for a long time. Prior to that, 12 years at PPD, a pharmaceutical global contract research organization. That was hard for me to say, so you'll have to explain that a little bit more in a little bit. But let me tell you a little bit more about why you should listen to Paul today. Now, Paul, as a security leader within a SaaS business, is going to be struggling with a lot of the challenges that many of you listening are. The constant change in adversaries, customer expectations, technical standards, budgets, you name it. But he's also been very successful at navigating the business landscape. And this is something that security leaders have been trying to drive at for years, to move from the technical corners up to the boardroom and engage broader stakeholders in the process of cybersecurity. And Paul's done that really well. I'm sure, again, he has some lessons on things he wish he hadn't done as well, which we could talk about too. When I asked Paul about his most proud accomplishment, it wasn't compliance standards or attaining a certain level of risk management for the business. I mean, I'm sure you are proud of those things. But it was actually about mentoring and developing his team. In particular, one team member who switched into security from finance, a completely different discipline, and has developed into an incredibly impressive InfoSec professional. It shows that with the right passion, the right tenacity, your brain working the right way, and the right mentor, it's really possible to bring people from diverse and non-technical backgrounds into our industry. And no doubt we'll touch a little bit on the skills gap today as well. So Paul, thanks for being with us here today and sharing some of your insights. It's going to be fun, I promise.
Pleasure, James.
And let me start with a really broad question here. It's been an interesting 12 months for CISOs. Mm-hmm. I would argue a little more interesting and tremulous than perhaps some of the years before. What are some of the big things you're thinking about that are disrupting, the role for security leaders at the moment? What's going on out there that we need to be thinking about on our pillows or at work?
I think it is a particularly challenging and transitional time for CISOs. I think, we're struggling with the macroeconomic climate globally. Right. Budgets are being squeezed, and doesn't really matter what industry you're in, that's impacting us all, or nearly all of us. And those budget squeezings are impacting our resourcing. So, our recruitment budgets are being tightened. Our InfoSec budgets are being tightened. And we've got this big sort of skill shortage in cybersecurity professionals. But at the same time, we're seeing projections of massive growth in cybersecurity, jobs.
Yeah.
I was reading
the threats aren't going anywhere, are they? And digital transformation projects aren't slowing.
It's a real mixed bag of signals. And I was reading a recent report from the World Economic Forum about the future of jobs. And they're predicting that cybersecurity, is one of the key drivers in jobs over the next 5 years. So, on the one hand, there seems to be, a demand for our skill sets and our talents, but on the other hand, budgets are being tightened, and we're seeing a lot of skill shortages.
The age-old more with less problem.
Exactly, and I certainly see that myself. When I'm recruiting, that it can be quite challenging to find the skills that you're looking for. So I think, it is a challenging time. And from sort of a technical perspective, if we look at what's happening with AI, that's bringing a lot of, change, that's something new that as cybersecurity leaders, we've got to learn, we've got to engage with.
And it's funny as well, isn't it? We're all talking about, AI, and of course we were going to end up there quickly in this conversation. And we're talking about it like one thing, But that's some of the challenge of it. There's all these different services, all these different capabilities moving so quickly, and trying to keep up with all of it, let alone implement sensible policies, educate the organization, and manage the risks, it's really taxing against the backdrop of having full complement teams, let alone all these economic headwinds at the same time.
You may have had the foresight to budget for AI a year ago, but
I did not. Full disclosure.
But neither did I. The likelihood is you didn't, and you may already have an AI acceptable use policy, but
just got there.
But the majority of us, still don't.
Yeah.
I think. There's a lot of uncertainty around AI, and I think uncertainty tends to sort of promote anxiety. Yeah, and we're all sort of, we're aware that it's here. It's not coming. It's here already. And we need to be engaging with it as professionals, and we need to be making use of that technology. But I think there's obviously a lack of sort of legislation. There's a lack of perhaps governance. There's a lack of standardization. So, we're finding our way a little bit at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting. And digging on the AI piece, and I want to jump back up a little bit to you talked about kind of anxiety and the pressures, because I think you're right. There's some broader themes there we should talk about. It's challenging on this AI stuff because the genie's out of the bottle. We're not putting it back in. It's happening in our organizations at a time where we maybe don't have a lot of resource cycles to spare in going after such large new initiatives. Certainly anxiety-inducing. But one of the great difficulties I find there is folks are incredibly rapidly trusting of AI. So many folks have no notion of the idea of a hallucination or that it might make stuff up. They treat it like a search engine. It's gospel. And that trust is very dangerous in security terms because we don't have wonderful technical tools yet or strong policy enforcement. We're kind of relying on people to exercise judgment. And the early judgment doesn't look great from the average person. There's this assumption of, oh, I can just use it. I can put the crown jewels in there. It'll help me analyze data. That's fine. And that seems a really difficult position to operate from.
I agree, and I think that's the fundamental point, isn't it? It's our role as security leaders is about balancing innovation and value to the business. It's getting that balance right between risk and how something's going to add value and drive the business forward. And I think with AI, there's that lack of regulation, legislation, standards, and people, in our roles, in our industry, we're having to sort of find our way and learn, where the risks are. How does this technology work? If I put something into a large language model, what's going to happen to that information?
Right. Do they collect that for their corpus? Does it go to someone else? How much can I trust their legal agreement?
And it's not just as simple as, if I put a load of personal information, okay, I know that's bad, the risks there are clear. But even if I, submit some queries, and perhaps not a query on its own, but an aggregation of queries, certain conclusions could be drawn from those queries by somebody else, and where does that end up?
It's just this whole new landscape of questions. Actually, I don't know if this works for you. It kind of reminds me of early cloud, when everyone said, we need to do cloud security, and you're like, well, that's like saying, I'm interested in having a meal. We need to do food. Well, what type of food? AWS, Azure, GCP, what type of service, what type of data? And the discussion was very generalized and high level, but implementation was running away rapidly ahead of the understanding of the risks and the specifics. I mean, this happened even more so with the pandemic, of course. People ran into the cloud really rapidly. And I think even now, kind of a couple of years later, if you will, there seems to be a lot of folks fighting rearguard action, trying to figure out the risks they've already accepted by default and manage them. And it feels like this is going to be another one of those unstoppable digital transformation trends we're fighting rearguard action on for a while.
I think so, and playing catch up, and the legislation is coming, and we take comfort from that, right, as leaders, because okay, there's a framework here, there's a set of guardrails, and we're going to build our policies and our controls around around those guardrails. But I also think a lot of those already exist today. If you're putting personal data into a large language, the GDPR comes into play, right?
Just uploading it to any other service.
There are those guardrails exist today. I mean, you may not be able to sort of follow the ultimate breadcrumb in terms of what's going to happen to your queries and your data, but if you go and read the privacy notice on the provider, there should be full transparency there, just as there is today outside of AI.
So maybe there's big chunks of this where we could just treat it like any other SaaS vendor, and in reality, it'll be some version of good.
I think it's not as simple as that, but I think that there's a lot of headway.
You threw in my perfect silver bullet,
I
Paul.
think
It was done. But I think you're right. I do think you're right. Sorry, please.
I think there's a lot of headway we can make as security professionals in sort of looking at existing standards. We know what the risks are with data, right? That's our bread and butter.
Yeah. Some version, I think, of what you're saying there for me is, we've seen this movie before. Yes, AI is going to have new challenges. There's a new dimension to the technology. It's quite exciting. I mean, there's a lot of good use cases as well as risk stuff that we could talk about, particularly in cybersecurity.
Yeah.
But we've seen this movie before. Highly disruptive, rapidly adopted technology, providing data to third parties and needing to manage risks in environments that are outside your control. These are things that maybe we know how to do more of than at first it seems when the hyperific term AI turns up.
Yeah, and I think there are some big questions, and not necessarily that we as security leaders, or we don't have to answer all of those questions ourselves.
Right.
I think things like source code. If you're using a tool to assist in source code generation or source code review, putting your source code somewhere outside of your network has historically been a difficult thing to do, right? And if you're going to put that,
challenges,
if you're going to put that into into a large language model, then you need to be sure what the risks are there.
You're providing an abstraction of it, and are you happy with that?
Are you happy with
IP risks too, of course.
You may not be, but on the other hand, if you know what's going to happen to that data, there's full transparency around what, then that might be a risk that you're prepared to tolerate. And I think it's that kind of understanding the unknowns that's going to help us to sort of feel more comfortable.
Which is going to be a process, right? Because it's going to be a moving target. We can start now and do more than many might think, but it is going to be a process as this stuff evolves, as kind of always. I think related to that, we might lift back to one of the points you were making before. You talked about some of the economic headwinds and challenges, some of the skills and team building challenges, new disruptive technologies like AI, and this kind of anxiety-inducing tensions. Mm-hmm. It does feel to me, like talking to a lot of security leaders, like it's a more anxious, high-pressure environment than it has been for a while. Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, I would argue security leadership and being a CISO and similar is up there at the best of times, actually, with the impact of attackers, the surface area of businesses, there may be a breach tomorrow, am I culpable? But it feels like we're a bit more in the pressure cooker than normal. Mm-hmm. Is that kind of a fair analysis from what you're describing? Are there other factors to it as well? Like, how do you feel about that pressure cooker of the moment?
Yeah, I think it's a fair analysis. Every day you wake up, this could be the day that that there's a breach, right? And probably if you are unfortunate enough to experience that, then everybody's going to be looking at you, wondering what you did wrong, right? You know,
And we keep saying there's no 100% in security. It will happen. It's a question of when, not a question of if. And if we're well prepared, it'll be less bad versus really bad.
yeah.
I don't think that necessarily helps what you've just described. Like we keep saying it, but it's still, is it today? And everyone's still going to look to you, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think, you know, the shift has sort of moved from, you know, it's no longer such a binary point. It's, you know, have you been breached or haven't you? I think, you know, the world has sort of changed to, you know, if there is a breach, as long as you haven't done a lot of silly things that took you to that place, I think it's more about how you've responded to that incident. You know,
it's almost, I heard this from somebody the other day, I want to get this right because I thought it was quite elegant. Doing things credibly enough that you fall into the camp of being a victim as opposed to being negligent. We're in the business of, I feel sorry for them, that sucks.
Yeah.
Because our execution was competent.
Yeah.
That actually sounds quite depressing to say out loud, but I think that is the reality of a lot of this stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there was a really interesting report, I think it was an IBM Ponemon report recently, that talked about the kind of average cost of a breach. It's averaged across a lot of organizations. They tended towards a number of about 5 million. Some are larger, some are smaller. And they calculated a kind of average of 1.49 million being the amount an organization can save just by being somewhat prepared on their incident response process,
right.
let alone the rest of it.
Yeah.
So even the kind of analysts looking at this stuff are shifting towards how little you bled. Not did you have a cut or not, but how much did you bleed as a kind of line of thinking.
Yeah.
Which at first I hated, but I actually think is a really business mature way to think about the level of security investment and risk. It's almost more the insurance and offset model than the absolutes of protection versus failure. But do you think this thinking is common in our community at the moment, or is this where we're moving? Are we being hyper-progressive here, Paul? Are we ahead of the curve?
Perhaps. I mean, maybe I'm wishful thinking. Maybe this is, you know, the direction of travel that I'd like to see it moving into. But you know, speaking personally, I think, you know, as long as when you read about an incident, you know, you as a professional in that, and you know, you want to sort of try and understand what went wrong. You know, what led up to that incident, and you know, if there was, you know, a vulnerability that was exploited in a bit of end-of-life software, then you should have known better, right? But if on the surface, you know, it looked like you did a lot of things right, and you were essentially unlucky, and somebody targeted you, and you know, then I think there's a growing sense of sympathy, and then you know, the attention turns to, well, what are you doing to mitigate that incident? You know, how transparent are you being with your, you know, customers or the people that are impacted?
That can make or break tone. I've seen organizations have pretty nasty breaches, but their response, their after-action results, their forensics, their transparency with customers is phenomenal, and it really limits the bleeding, like the triage works. And I've seen others have good technical defense and fail at transparency, and you know, really have quite the whiplash feeling from the community and from their customers.
Yeah.
So I do think there's something to that transparency and visible ownership.
I think so, and I think, you know, that looks good. You know, it puts you in a positive light publicly, but also I think, you know, in terms of what's going on within your own business, the more ready, to your point, that you are to respond to an incident, you know, probably, you know, you're going to limit the damage, and then, you know, you're back on your feet as a business.
The recovery is
far quicker.
It ticks all the boxes, doesn't it? Because I mean, at the end, you could be a shameless capitalist and think from a business perspective and disregard concern of data and optics and everything else, and just say, well, that's just the way to be up and operating quicker and getting people back to doing their jobs.
Yeah.
Let alone all the other stuff that also matters.
Yeah.
Which is why it's so funny to me here in 2023, so many organizations still have the paperwork and never practice it until it's too late and make a hash of it. Maybe it's a cobbler's shoes thing. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, certainly I've found a lot of value, through doing those sort of incident response simulations, and
yeah, I know you practice. I wasn't casting aspersions.
But no matter the size of the organisation you're in, you may think, well, if it happens, I know exactly the people that I'm going to pull together on that day, and it's going to be, the day's going to suck, but these are the people that I need,
team.
and I'm going to pull them together, and we'll get through it. But the reality is that some of those people may not be available on that day. They might be on holiday. They might just be unavailable.
Yeah.
They
Life
may
happens.
not. You're thinking, well, I know what I want, such and such person to do, but they may not be comfortable in that role on the day. Right. So
they may be sitting there questioning whether they can make that decision with their boss out. Or
exactly. So I think it does. Even though you think it may never happen to you, I think it really does add a lot of value to the business to at least think about the roles and the responsibilities if it were to happen.
No, I strongly agree with that. Look, I see a lot of organizations that invest in being technically prepared. They fail often when they're doing that work to reap the benefits of practicing the process and prepping the people. You have to think about them slightly differently to achieve that. Any of us can run a pen test and try and break some stuff. But how's the team respond? How would they respond? How do they work with each other? What relationships need to be forged that are missing? Those things they're easy to miss in just doing a technical task.
Exactly, and I could write the perfect business continuity policy, disaster incident
You should
response.
do that for everyone, by the way. Sorry, carry on.
And but until to your point, until you actually put that into practice, the document on itself, okay, it has value, but
it's better than no document.
But when it counts, there's no substitute for sort of knowing, having some of the personalities in place, knowing, what their roles are, what's expected of them on the day.
Being practiced.
You might have read the document 10 times, but the chances are, the others might not have read it at all.
Yeah, for sure, or just forgotten it or whatever else. And you're right, the nice thing is when you work through that process as well, you spot the gaps as a leader, don't you? You kind of go, oh, that person doesn't have the right technical training on how to do that memory capture. They don't know how to do that. I need to upskill them there. Or, oh, I've only got one person who has access to Y. We need to fix that. We've got to run a rights project. Like, I find you unturn those stones with people, and it adds a whole new dimension to how you think about building team capability, as opposed to just a list of roles. Like, it comes to life.
Yes, and you understand how people will, even in simulation, you get a sense of how people will respond in, because you may sort of look at somebody and say, well, they're a technical guru in their day-to-day work, but in a sort of disaster or an incident scenario, they might respond very differently.
I mean, I've definitely never at any point in my career, a couple of years in, panicked and accidentally locked out 130,000 Active Directory accounts.
Oops.
I've never done that. Right? So but that's why we practice.
Yeah.
You don't kind of give people guns and go, hey, try not to shoot each other. There's a training regimen and kind of work you do together, and you figure out people's strengths and weaknesses and look at the team holistically.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to sort of cost a lot. You don't have to make a big investment in a simulation. I started using some sort of tabletop simulation exercises that were made available for free from the NCSC.
Oh, no, yeah, those are good. Yeah, great way to start.
They're a starting point, and quite often the hardest thing is starting something, right? And there was something, download for free, bring together 4 or 5 people in the room.
Start the process.
It may not be the most eloquent, sophisticated, simulation,
but you can get to that. Right?
But you've made it. You've started to think. You've started to see the risks, the pitfalls, the things that can go wrong. How people respond.
And in that, You'll find the bits of training people need. You'll find the person that's missing from the table. You'll find the person that maybe lacks a bit of confidence that you need to work on some soft skills and all those things as well.
Yeah, and hey, I don't have such and such's mobile number in my phone, and
Yeah.
I'm used to picking them up on Teams every day, but actually now I can't get hold of them.
One of my personal favourites, working incident once, kind of coming in halfway through because they couldn't get the drop on getting this attacker out of the environment. The attacker was actually sat in their war room listening to the team working together because they'd compromised the accounts that literally they were, you're like, oh no. You're like, so what's the backup plan? And you watch them all go, oh yeah, the only way we can talk to each other is this one thing that's been compromised. There's no plan B.
Yeah.
So practice, for me, I agree, is crucial. And I love your point about the multidisciplinary, not just the technical, beyond it. And your point there of it doesn't have to cost a lot. We spend all this money on tools, on people, not doing that last 5% of work to figure out your readiness and how you improve it, for me, is missing all the value from the stuff that you already spent money on. You don't know you're getting the most from it.
Yeah.
So it's an important part of the process.
But yeah, it's you're looking at yourself in the mirror, right? And
it's a good way to put it.
We're all good at, well, we might be all good at writing policy documents and implementing controls, but it's the effectiveness, isn't it, of those things that really matters.
How they apply to the organization. Otherwise, it's just words. I'm going to get all mine from ChatGPT. It's going to be fine. Don't worry about it. But if I might pivot on you a little bit, Paul, I guess somewhat related, actually. You've been very successful in engaging the broader business, helping them to understand that security is a two-way process. Mm-hmm. They own part of that risk. You own it together. Mm-hmm. It's not just some IT folks in the corner doing some technical stuff who will take care of security.
Yeah.
There is also very much a building pressure amongst security leaders to engage the board or their respective senior management structure. In fact, in the US, lots of regulatory requirements pushing to put CISOs on the board directly, so there's a board seat of accountability for security risk. A probable direction of travel, I'm suspecting, that will be global for many industries. What would what would you say are some of the kind of key tactics you've used to build those board relationships, to communicate effectively? Have you got any kind of high-level do's and don'ts? Because I know there are lots of CISOs listening who know they need to do this stuff, but it's not their natural instinct. They've grown out of technical professions and are struggling with this a bit. Like, pro tip me.
It is definitely a challenging area, and I think you've got to try and understand the language that the board speaks in, and first and foremost, that's really risk to the business. Yeah. Certainly in terms of cybersecurity. Yeah.
This happens. It can have this impact. Here is a business consequence.
Exactly.
Not exploit bad 0 day.
It's really hard to strike, and I found it hard to strike that balance between sort of overwhelming with technical detail, because as a cybersecurity, that's your comfort zone,
we live.
Right?
Yeah, it's where we live.
I could talk about vulnerabilities and compliance metrics all day, but arguably that's probably not that interesting to sort of the average board member. So it's about
You're very polite with arguably. Yes.
It's about striking that balance between the technical and making it interesting enough to the board. Sort of the tactics that I've used, is to try and demonstrate, the value of the cybersecurity program to the business. What am I doing to enable the business? If you're a technology services provider, or perhaps what are you doing to make it easier for your customers to engage with you? That might be a trust center on your website. It might be a security white paper.
So reducing friction to revenue, I mean, is a great thing boards tend to care about.
Exactly. You know, what am I doing to help, you know, make it easier for our customers to engage? I think in any business, you know, what am I doing as a leader to promote and raise awareness of cybersecurity? You know, phishing simulations, you know, good password. You know, there's a list there, right, of basic things that any business should be doing. So I think, you know, trying to position, you know, not too much technical detail, but, you know, striking that balance. So how are you enabling the business? I think it can be useful to show how you're performing in relation to your competitors.
Yep,
you know,
definitely.
Board members.
I'm right-sizing the capability for you in this business.
Seem to find that interesting. And there are tools out there, you know, there are third-party vendor risk assessment, attack surface management tools that, you know, that you can use to sort of look at your vendors, but you can also turn them back on yourself. So, you know, that look in the mirror, you know, what am I showing publicly? And while that is, you know, only a small part of anyone's security posture, you know, the way I look at those tools is if you're not looking too clean on the outside, then there's a reasonable chance that things aren't too great on the inside.
It does tend to follow, doesn't it?
You know, and I think, you know, scorecards have their place.
You've got to choose the right metrics, though, haven't you?
But it's all about the metrics.
Yeah.
You know, it's not, you know, it may be how many servers did we patch on time last month, but I think, you know, it's also about, you know, how many new starters did we successfully train in, you know, how many new starters did we train in information security, you know, and what was the average time that it took to train them?
Do you say enabling the business, on-ramping folks, getting them productive, managing their security risk as they start, you know, at the organization?
Exactly. You know, it may be how many lever accounts did we disable on date of departure, or whatever your commitment is. It's some of those sort of maybe technical, but easier to relate to.
People and business.
People and process orientated.
One I've seen turning up a lot recently that I like, there's obviously a lot more compliance standards or soft standards worked into procurement. So being able to address certain markets, you have your SaaS product, being able to address certain markets, you need certain standards, security identifying those, and being able to do revenue support by getting the organization ready to be compliant with those, to enable procurement, enable teams. That can be a good one.
Yeah.
Although they're not always a lot of fun to do.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, we have a really important place as cybersecurity leaders in the procurement function, in the onboarding of software, you know, and a good procurement process, you know, involves IT, it involves security, it involves legal, and, you know, it definitely involves finance. You know, there are tools out there now that, you know, that sort of help us achieve those goals a lot easier.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And so it sounds like, you know, the real key here, it's funny when you talk about this kind of building board relationships, communicating as a security leader, it always sounds so patronizing and easy. It's like, well, duh, we just need to speak their language. It is that easy, but it's hard to do, isn't it? You know, some of the big things for me, I think you're touching on, figure out that business language, spend time listening to it. You know, how do different, you know, C-level executives or board members talk about your organization, think about your organization? What are their primary concerns? What are the big growth initiatives? And how can you connect that back to security? And then you have the metrics one. And we always talk about metrics, they're important. Well, if that's the case, why do I still see so many terrible scorecards with overtly technical metrics no board would ever care about? Everyone listening, you know, should do what Paul's saying and step back and look at those metrics and go, if I am not technical, why do I care?
What does this mean to me?
What does this mean to me, right? If I'm interested in the health of this business, its income, its costs, its people, its risk, can I use this piece of data in any way to think about those things?
Yeah.
And if brutally you can't, your scorecard is bad.
it may make sense to you, but it's not adding value outside of your function, right?
And
your
that's the
world.
role we play now if we're going to interrelate with boards and communicate with the broader business.
Yeah. And I think, you need to understand exactly what the objectives of your business are. And, they may be as simple as we want to grow revenue.
Right.
But, okay, well, how, and...
Are we protecting the castle? Are we aggressively pursuing growth and taking on risk? Like, what's the tone of the organization?
Exactly. And, what can I do to help, promote, to drive that strategy?
Yeah. And in reality, a lot of security initiatives can be connected back to that rhythm beat of an organization and their goals. It always sounds cheesy, like our first attempts at this in the industry, this kind of security ROI. That stuff was really cringeworthy for me, and it just didn't work. Yeah. But I think the examples you're giving do work. If we're focusing on international growth and exploding into new territories, that tells you a lot about what type of work is going to be important in the security function to support the people in those territories, the compliance standards and regulations in those territories.
Exactly.
It's directly growth connected.
Exactly. And I think, it also all comes back down to risk, and as a security leader, I don't think that we should own all risk, and I don't think, we need to stand in front of the board and say, right, these are all the risks, and, we own them within cybersecurity.
I'm the guy. Here's a gun.
I'm the guy, and because I think you're probably setting yourself up for failure. But I don't think that's the best way to approach risk management. But I do think that our role as leaders is to sort of mentor the business, the other business leaders, just to steer, to drive them towards a place where they're thinking about risk.
We shepherd the balance of risk.
A great word.
Just came up with that. Trademark. James and Paul, 2023.
I've noted that. And what does that look like in practice? I think it looks like, for me, it looks like sitting down with, your leaders, the people within your business that get stuff done, and sort of having the risk conversation, and that can be a really difficult, it's like, well, okay, I want to put this meeting in your calendar, I want to talk about risk. It's the last thing I want to do.
Particularly on a Friday at 4 o'clock.
Really. But then, when you start engaging with people, and it's amazing what comes back.
Yeah.
And they are ready to talk about it.
Yeah. So what you're saying is, buy some coffees, buy some glasses of wine, some donuts, lunches, whatever it takes. Spend some time with folks.
Spend some time with. I mean, it boils down to relationships as well, and making
donuts work.
Making donuts work.
And your greatest tool
is
for being a CISO that's effective with the board is pastries,
sugar-coated pastry. Yeah.
But facetiousness aside, I think you're right. A lot of the time as leaders, I've certainly been guilty of this. We furrow into the technical. We furrow into our teams. We have our head down on the stuff. And not because we're stupid. There's always too much to do in a security function. I've never met a team that wasn't at 100% capacity. As leaders, we have to do that thing where you block some time in the calendar to talk to others. You have to force that relationship building with a broader business and not allow it to be cancelled or acquiesced from it.
You do. You have to start the conversation. You have to carry the conversation. You have to make people think about risk, but present it in their terms. This isn't necessarily a technical conversation. Yeah, of course there might be some technical risks, but let's broaden the conversation out. What are the things that are you worried about in your function? Risk is essentially, the barriers to an organization achieving its objectives, yeah? And for sure, some of those are cybersecurity related, but there will be a gamut of, commercial, resource, organizational issues in that bucket, and they're all as valid.
And when we say cybersecurity is very technical, and it is, but of course, we start talking about financial risk and you get a CFO talking, I mean, their density of acronyms and confusing terms definitely matches ours, I think. I mean, that stuff can get pretty technical. I mean, it can be pretty wild. So hey, I know I've taken up way too much of your time. This is fascinating. I'm gonna ask you one more question. I'm gonna pad for time for you briefly whilst you get to think about it. And your one last question. If you had one piece of advice for your peers, to folks listening to this, as they're surviving the tensions, the pressure cooker we talked about right at the top, as they think about the rest of the year and their business, like if you had one piece of advice, you say, take a look at this, or think about this, or don't do that. Paul's masterclass, if you will. What would you pick?
It's not one word, but it's prioritize. And it may sound really simple, but whenever I'm under pressure most, I've got limited resources, limited budget, all these things I need to do, all these things I need to think about, worry about. I just try and prioritize. You can't do everything. And, somebody once said to me, do less better. And it's a luxury, right? And we'd all love to, to live like that. But I think it's something that, that we should try and,
Because there is too much. You literally cannot do it all.
You can't
and the list
do it
is
all.
growing.
And if you try and do it all, then you spread yourself too thin, and inevitably you don't do some of it well.
We end up being one of those security leaders or CISOs that has to move organization for the reasons we've discussed. Force rank. Write it down and draw a line somewhere.
Yeah, so prioritize, think about things in terms of what's really important to your business, what's really important in terms of risk, and make that, that's really easy to defend. What isn't easy to defend is, I had so many things I needed to do that I spread myself too thinly, and, now we're in a mess.
Yeah. Not really good justification for a senior leader, is it? That's wonderful advice. And again, like with all this stuff in business leadership, it sounds so simple, you can kind of roll your eyes, but you got to do it. So with that, Paul, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. Fascinating content, lots for people to apply here. And I'm sure we'll get some follow-up questions flowing very soon. And hopefully it wasn't too scary. You do it again?
No, it was good.
Fantastic.
Do it again.
Should we just, next time we need a couple of pints of beer or something,
that would be
like a mini pub, it would be really cool.
That would help.
But thank you so much again, Paul. Really appreciate it. And
Thank you.
keep on managing those priorities.
All right. Thank you, James.